The autumn storm that descended upon London was not merely a weather event, it was a siege. Rain fell in relentless, punishing sheets, turning the usually dignified cobblestone streets of Mayfair into churning rivers of mud and debris. The gas lamps, usually beacons of civilization against the night, flickered and died like suffocated stars, leaving the city in a gloom that seemed to seep into the very bones of its inhabitants. Yet within the gilded cage of Harrington House, the storm was nothing more than a distant rumour, a muffled drumming against the thick glass of the ballroom windows. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of beeswax, expensive perfume, and the burning tallow of 1,000 candles, creating a stifling warmth that insulated the cream of English nobility from the cold reality outside. Lady Delilah Montford stood at the periphery of this glittering assembly, a solitary figure in ivory silk. To the casual observer, she was the picture of serene beauty, her auburn hair arranged in a flawless coiffure, her violet blue eyes observing the dancers with polite interest, but beneath the surface a current of melancholy ran deep. At 23, she felt less like a participant in the season's festivities and more like a carefully curated exhibit. Her hand rested on the cool glass of the window, sensing the vibration of the thunder, a wild and chaotic force that felt infinitely more honest than the choreographed smiles and whispered judgments filling the room behind her. She was watched, as she always was, by the protective, suffocating gaze of her brother, Philip, the Marquis of Ashford. Since their father's death 2 years prior, Philip had assumed the role of guardian with an intensity that bordered on obsession, steering her through society with a rigid grip, ensuring she remained untouched by scandal or struggle. The evening was proceeding with the predictable, numbing rhythm of every ball that had preceded it. The orchestra played the same waltzes, the same eligible bachelors offered the same rehearsed compliments, the same dowagers held court in the corners, dissecting reputations with surgical precision. Delilah was preparing to resign herself to another hour of forced pleasantries when the atmosphere in the cavernous room underwent a sudden, violent shift. It began near the grand entrance, a cessation of laughter, a drop in the volume of conversation that rippled outward like a shockwave. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, laden with confusion and a collective intake of breath. The orchestra faltered, the musicians sensing the change in the room's temperature, until the music trailed off into an uneasy quiet. Delilah turned from the window, her curiosity piqued by the sudden stillness. The crowd was parting, creating a wide corridor from the top of the grand staircase down to the center of the dance floor. All eyes were fixed on the figure standing at the precipice of the stairs. He was a man who seemed to have brought the storm inside with him. Tall and imposing, his presence dominated the space, casting a shadow that felt longer and darker than the candlelight allowed. He wore black, stark and unadorned, a sharp contrast to the colourful silks and velvets of the nobility surrounding him. His hair was the colour of midnight, wet and slightly dishevelled, as if he had walked through the tempest without a care for shelter. But it was his face that arrested the room, a landscape of harsh angles and unforgiving lines, marked by a cold, predatory beauty. A whisper moved through the crowd, a hiss of recognition mixed with disbelief. The name Veilbrook floated on the air, spoken with a mixture of fear and scandalized delight. Delilah felt a chill race down her spine. The Duke of Veilbrook, Damian Alistair. The name was a ghost story in London society, a cautionary tale whispered in drawing rooms. 8 years ago, he had been the golden son of the peerage, only to vanish in a cloud of disgrace following accusations of cheating at cards and the subsequent shame-induced death of his father. He was supposed to be dead, or at least rotting in some forgotten corner of the colonies, broken and destitute. Yet here he stood, not broken, but forged into something harder, radiating a dangerous vitality that made the other men in the room look like soft, pampered children. He descended the stairs with a slow, deliberate cadence, the sound of his boots on the marble echoing in the silence. He did not look at the crowd. His gaze was fixed forward, unblinking, sweeping the room with the cool indifference of a wolf surveying a flock of sheep. There was no apology in his bearing, no hint of the shame that society demanded of him. Instead, there was a palpable sense of purpose, a cold fire burning beneath the surface of his composure. As he reached the ballroom floor, the guests recoiled slightly, pressing back against the walls, as if afraid that his very touch might taint them. Delilah found herself unable to look away. From her vantage point across the room, she watched as his grey eyes, storm clouds captured in human form, locked onto hers. The impact was physical, a jolt that stopped her breath. In that brief, silent exchange, there was no recognition of social standing, no polite deferral. It was a raw, unmasked assessment. He began to move toward her, cutting a straight line through the terrified assembly. The crowd parted readily, no one daring to obstruct his path. Philip, who had been conversing with a group of lords nearby, froze, his face draining of colour as he recognized the man approaching his sister. The Duke stopped before Delilah, bringing with him the scent of rain, sandalwood and ozone. Up close, the devastation of the last 8 years was visible in the fine lines around his eyes and the grim set of his mouth, but it only served to enhance his terrifying allure. He did not bow low. He merely inclined his head, a gesture that mocked the formalities of the room. Without speaking a word that could be overheard by the straining ears of the onlookers, he extended a hand. It was a challenge, not an invitation. To accept would be social suicide. To refuse would be a public scene. Delilah, driven by an impulse she could not name, a rebellion against the suffocating safety of her life, placed her gloved hand in his. The orchestra, perhaps fearing the tension would snap the very strings of their instruments, hurriedly began a waltz. The Duke swept her onto the floor. His hold was firm, possessing a strength that spoke of physical labor and hardship, far removed from the idle. Lives of the gentleman she knew. As they moved, the surrounding world blurred into a wash of color, leaving only the stark reality of the man holding her. He did not make small talk. He did not compliment her gown or the weather. Instead, he spoke in low, clipped tones, his voice a rough vibration against the silence between them. He told her that he had returned not for the season, nor for the forgiveness of the people staring at them, but for a debt that remained unpaid. He spoke of a house stripped of its honor and a grave that demanded justice. Delilah listened, her heart hammering against her ribs. She realized with a dawning horror that his presence here was not a random return. It was a calculated strike, and the target was close. His eyes kept flickering over her shoulder, not looking at the crowd, but fixing with lethal intensity on a specific point in the room. Following his gaze during a turn of the dance, she saw her brother. Philip was not watching with the protective concern he usually displayed. He was watching with naked, unadulterated fear. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his posture rigid, his face a mask of panic that he was struggling to suppress. The revelation struck Delilah with the force of a physical blow. The scandal that had destroyed the Duke, the story of the marked cards and the ruined family, Philip had been at the center of it. He had always told her that he had been a mere witness, a reluctant participant in the exposure of a cheat. But the dynamic playing out on the dance floor told a different story. The Duke was not looking at Philip with the shame of a guilty man facing his accuser. He was looking at him with the righteous fury of a victim facing his executioner. The music ended abruptly. The spell broke. Before the final notes had faded, Philip was there, striding onto the floor and seizing Delilah's arm with a grip that bruised. He placed himself between his sister and the Duke, his chest heaving. The confrontation that followed was silent but deafening. No shouts were exchanged, but the air between the two men crackled with hatred. The Duke looked down at Philip with a cold, terrifying sneer, his silence more insulting than any curse. He held Philip's gaze for a long, agonizing moment, then turned his back on the Marquis, a gesture of supreme dismissal, and walked away, disappearing into the crowd as quickly as he had arrived, leaving a wake of whispers and scandal behind him. The carriage ride back to Grosvenor Square was a suffocating experience. The rain continued to hammer against the roof, echoing the turmoil in Delilah's mind. Philip sat opposite her, staring out into the darkness, his jaw clenched, his hand trembling slightly where it rested on his knee. He offered no explanation. For his behavior, no reassurance. His silence was an admission in itself. Delilah watched him, seeing her brother not as the infallible protector she had always known, but as a man cornered, a man hiding a rot beneath his polished exterior. Upon arriving home, Philip retreated immediately to his study, ordering the servants to bring brandy and denying any visitors. Delilah climbed the stairs to her room, but sleep was an impossibility. She dismissed her maid and sat by the window, watching the storm rage over London. The events of the evening replayed in her mind with clarity. The Duke's arrival, the raw power of his presence, the terrified look in Philip's eyes. The official narrative of 8 years ago, the one she had accepted without question, began to unravel. She remembered the sudden influx of wealth that had saved their estate shortly after their father's death. Money, Philip claimed, came from wise investments. She remembered how Philip had discouraged her from asking questions about the past, how he had severed ties with certain old friends. The pieces were forming a grotesque picture. If the Duke was innocent, if he had been framed, then her brother was not merely a bystander. He was a monster who had destroyed a family to save his own fortune. Delilah stood, her decision crystallizing in the cold air of her room. She could not live in the shadow of a lie. The Duke had returned for justice, and his gaze had promised that he would burn London to the ground to get it. If Philip was innocent, the truth would save him. If he was guilty, he deserved to fall. But she would not be a pawn in their war. She needed to know what had really happened that night at the card tables. She moved to her writing desk, unlocking a small drawer where she kept her private correspondence. She would not ask Philip again. His fear had made him a liar. She would go to the source. She would find the ghost who had walked out of the storm and demand the truth he had whispered during their waltz. As the candle burned low, casting long dancing shadows against the walls, Delilah realized that the safety of her world had been shattered. The storm outside was no longer just weather. It was a harbinger of the devastation to come. She picked up her pen, the scratching of the nib on paper the only sound in the silent house, and began to write, initiating a sequence of events that would unearth secrets buried deep in the mud of the past. The morning sun that rose over London offered no warmth, its pale light struggling to pierce the lingering grey shroud of the storm. Inside the Montford residence, the atmosphere was brittle, the air thick with unspoken accusations and the heavy silence of secrets kept. Delilah had descended the stairs early, driven by a restlessness that had made sleep impossible, only to find the library door ajar. Through the gap, she had observed Philip, not attending to the estate correspondence as was his custom, but kneeling before the fireplace. He was feeding papers to the flames with a frantic, jerky rhythm, his usual composure entirely abandoned. The fire roared, consuming ledgers and letters alike, casting a demonic glow on his pale, sweating face. It was the action of a man erasing his history, a desperate attempt to turn evidence into ash before the day truly began. She had retreated silently. The image of her brother's fear burned into her mind, confirming the dreadful suspicions that had taken root. The night before. The note she had written in the dead of night found its way to its destination through a trusted footman, a relic of her father's time who owed allegiance to the family name rather than its current, trembling patriarch. The response was immediate and discreet, a location and a time devoid of signature but bearing the unmistakable seal of the Veilbrook crest, a sprawling hawk that seemed ready to strike. The meeting place was not the manicured paths of Hyde Park where society paraded, but the overgrown, secluded gardens of a derelict estate on the outskirts of Hampstead, a place forgotten by the ton, where privacy was guaranteed by neglect. Delilah arrived under the pretense of a charity call, her carriage left at a distance, her hood drawn low against the chill wind. Damian Alistair was already there, standing amidst the ruins of a stone fountain, looking less like a nobleman and more like a sentinel guarding the wreckage of the past. He did not waste time with pleasantries. As she approached, the narrative of his return began to unfold, not with the emotional outbursts she had expected, but with the cold, hard precision of a military report. He spoke of the years in India, not of the hardships, but of the clarity distance had provided. He had not spent his exile merely surviving. He had spent it gathering intelligence, piecing together the mechanism of his destruction with the patience of a spider weaving a web. The story he laid out was a complex machinery of deceit. It was not merely a case of marked cards, it was a conspiracy born of financial desperation. Damian revealed the existence of a ledger, one that Philip had likely believed destroyed years ago. It detailed the Montford family's financial standing prior to the scandal, a portrait of absolute ruin. The late Marquis, their father, had not left them a fortune but a mountain of hidden debt. Philip, young and terrified of losing his status, had been easy prey for Lord Pemberton, a man known for his charm and his empty pockets. Pemberton had devised the scheme: destroy the Duke of Veilbrook, force him into exile, and then acquire his assets at a fraction of their value during the ensuing fire sale. Philip's role had been to provide the access and the credibility, to be the honourable witness who validated the lie. The revelation of the motive, money, cold and simple, struck Delilah harder than the accusation of malice. It stripped the tragedy of any romantic notion of rivalry or misunderstanding. Her comfortable life, her dresses, the very roof over her head, had been purchased with the destruction of another man's life. Damian presented these facts without raising his voice, his detachment making the horror of it more palpable. He described the bribed valet, a man named Thomas, who had planted the cards, and who had been handsomely paid to vanish into the continent. But Thomas was a ghost, lost to the winds of Europe. The weak link, Damian explained, was not the man who had planted the evidence, but the man who had coordinated the payment. There was a second witness, a man named James Whitmore, formerly a footman in the Pemberton household. Whitmore had been the courier for the blood money. Unlike the valet, Whitmore had not fled abroad. He had remained in England, paralysed by a fear of travel and a sickly constitution, living in obscurity in a small village in Kent, funded by a mysterious monthly allowance that had ceased exactly 3 days ago, the day Damian returned to London. The cessation of payments was a signal, a threat. It meant that Philip and Pemberton knew the game was up and were cutting loose ends. If Whitmore was found by Philip's agents first, his silence would be bought with steel rather than gold. Delilah realized the precariousness of their position. The burning of the papers in the library took on a new, sinister significance. Philip was not just hiding the past, he was actively burying the trails that led to the present. She faced the Duke, the wind whipping strands of hair across her face, and made her offer. It was a bargain forged in desperation. She would aid him, she would provide the cover necessary to travel to Kent without raising the alarm of the society gossips or Philip's spies. She would use her status as a sister concerned for a sick relative to mask their movement. In exchange, she demanded a stay of execution. Damian was to seek the truth and a public exoneration, not a blood feud. He would give Philip the opportunity to confess, to face justice on human terms, rather than being destroyed by the Duke's wrath. The alliance was fragile, built on a foundation of shared grief and opposing loyalties. Damian agreed, though the fire in his eyes suggested his restraint was a leash barely holding back a starving animal. They orchestrated their departure with meticulous care. Delilah returned home and spun a fabrication of a sudden illness befalling an old aunt in the country, a story thin enough to be questioned, but urgent enough to bypass immediate verification. She observed Philip closely as she relayed the lie. He was distracted, his eyes bloodshot, his hands stained with ink and ash. He barely registered her departure, his mind clearly consumed by the encroaching shadows of his own making. He was a man waiting for a blow to land, flinching at every sound, unaware that the blow was already in motion. The journey to Kent was undertaken in an unmarked carriage, the crests covered, the blinds drawn. The confined space forced an intimacy that was both terrifying and illuminating. As the city gave way to the bleak, grey countryside, the narrative shifted from the technicalities of the conspiracy to the human cost of it. Damian spoke of the night his father died, the silence of the house, the unopened letters of support that never came. He described the isolation of being branded a cheat, a label that stuck to the skin like tar. Delilah, in turn, shared the reality of life with Philip, the frantic attempts to maintain appearances, the sudden influx of wealth that she'd been too young to question, the suffocating protectiveness that she now recognized as guilt manifesting as control. They were two survivors of the same shipwreck, finally comparing notes on the storm that had sunk them. The carriage rattled over rutted roads, moving deeper into the rural quiet. But the sense of urgency inside was deafening. They were racing against time. Damian had received intelligence that men matching the description of Pemberton's associates had been seen heading south. If they arrived at Whitmore's cottage too late, the truth would die with the invalid, and the only path left would be a war of hearsay that would leave no one standing. Upon reaching the village, a hamlet of thatched roofs and muddy lanes, the tension became physical. The cottage described in Damian's dossier sat on the edge of the wood, isolated and silent. There was no smoke rising from the chimney, a detail that sent a chill through Delilah. The garden was overgrown, the windows dark. It had the air of a place that had been holding its breath. They approached on foot, leaving the carriage hidden in a copse of trees. The silence of the woods was heavy, unnatural. There were no birds singing, only the sound of their boots sinking into the wet earth. The front door was unlocked. It swung open with a groan that sounded like a warning. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of sickness and old dust. But beneath it lay a faint, metallic tang that Delilah recognized instantly, though she had never smelled it in such quantity: copper blood. The main room was in disarray, furniture overturned, drawers pulled out and emptied onto the floor. It was a scene of frantic searching. Someone had been here, and they had been looking for something specific, perhaps the very records Damian had hoped to find. Damian moved with the silent efficiency of a predator, signaling for Delilah to stay by the door, but she followed him, compelled by a need to see the reality of her brother's actions. In the bedroom, the search had been just as violent, the mattress slashed, the floorboards pried up. But the room was empty of life. There was no body, only a large, dark stain on the rug near the window and a set of muddy footprints leading out the back door toward the deeper woods. The footprints were heavy, deep, implying a burden being carried. The realization was immediate and terrifying. They were not too late to save Whitmore from being found, but they were too late to save him from being taken. The lack of a body suggested he was still alive, likely being taken to a secondary location for interrogation or disposal. The footprints were fresh, the mud still seeping into the impressions. The enemy was close. Damian knelt by the stain, touching the damp wool of the rug, his face hardening into a mask of resolve. He looked up at Delilah, and the grey of his eyes had turned to steel. The time for investigation was over. The pursuit had begun. But as they turned to leave, a sound from the floorboards beneath the overturned bed stopped them, a faint rhythmic scratching, like a mouse trapped in a wall or a man tapping out a desperate signal. Damian shoved the bed frame aside and found a loose board. Beneath it was not a person but a small, leather-bound book missed by the intruders in their violence. He opened it, and the contents caused him to freeze. It was not just a ledger of payments, it was a diary. Whitmore had documented everything, every meeting, every threat, every pound of silver paid for his silence. And on the final page, dated that very morning, was a scribbled entry written in a shaky hand: "They are coming. Pemberton's men. If I'm gone. Look to the old mill at Blackwood. They will not kill me until they know where the book is." The clue was a lifeline, but it was also a trap. The old mill was miles away, across treacherous terrain, and night was falling rapidly. Delilah looked at the diary, the physical proof of her family's corruption, and felt the last vestiges of her childhood innocence shatter. She was holding the weapon that could execute her brother's reputation, but to use it, she had to survive the night. As they stepped back out into the gathering dark, a distant snap of a twig broke the silence. They were not just hunters anymore. They were being hunted. The forest around them seemed to close in, watching, waiting. The pact they had made in the safety of London was about to be tested in the unforgiving dark of the Kentish woods, where titles meant nothing, and the only law was survival. The forest surrounding the cottage had transformed from a place of rustic solitude into a labyrinth of shadows and hidden threats. With the discovery of the diary and the realization that James Whitmore had been forcibly taken, the dynamic of the evening shifted irrevocably from investigation to rescue. The sun had fully dipped below the horizon, leaving the Kentish countryside bathed in a bruised purple twilight that rapidly surrendered to the absolute black of a moonless night. The air grew colder, biting through layers of silk and wool, a physical reminder of the precariousness of their situation. Delilah and Damian moved away from the ransacked cottage, their footsteps careful and deliberate on the damp earth, guided only by the faint, ghostly outline of the path and Damian's innate sense of direction. The destination was Blackwood Mill, a location known to locals only as a derelict ruin, a relic of an industrial past that had long since rotted away. The diary, tucked securely inside Damian's coat against his heart, felt heavy, not with paper and ink, but with the weight of the lives it had the potential to destroy. It was the tangible proof of a conspiracy that had sat like a poison at the center of the Montford family for 8 years, documenting every bribe, every lie, and every moment of cowardice that had paved Philip's road to financial security. But the diary alone was a static object. Without Whitmore to authenticate it, to stand before a magistrate and swear to its veracity, it remained vulnerable to claims of forgery. The man had to be secured. The journey to the mill was arduous. The terrain was unforgiving, a tangle of ancient roots and slick mud that sought to ensnare the ankles of the unwary. Delilah, dressed in attire suited for a drawing room rather than a manhunt, found herself tested to her physical limits, yet she did not complain. The adrenaline of the discovery and the horror of the blood-stained rug drove her forward, fueling a resolve she had not known she possessed. She watched Damian moving ahead of her, a shadow among shadows, his posture tense and alert. He was no longer the scandalous Duke of the ballroom. He was a man returning to the raw survival instincts he had honed during his exile. He stopped frequently, listening to the wind, checking for the snap of a twig or the murmur of voices that would betray the presence of Pemberton's men. As they crested a ridge, the silhouette of Blackwood Mill emerged against the starless sky. It was a skeletal structure, its great wooden wheel broken and half submerged in the rushing water of the river that powered it. The main building leaned precariously, its roof sagging like a broken spine. Light spilled from the cracks in the boarded-up windows, cutting sharp yellow lines through the darkness. It was the only sign of life in the desolate valley, a beacon that signaled danger rather than safety. The roar of the river masked the sound of their approach, allowing them to creep close to the perimeter of the clearing. Damian signaled for a halt behind the decaying remains of a stone wall. From this vantage point, the situation became clear. Two men stood guard by the only visible door. Their postures relaxed, but their weapons, heavy clubs and a pistol tucked into a belt, clearly visible in the spill of light. They were not soldiers, but hired muscle, the kind of men who did dirty work for coin without asking questions. Inside, shadows moved across the slats of the windows, indicating at least two more occupants. It was a holding cell, a place to interrogate a terrified old man before disposing of him in the river where the current would carry the evidence away. The rescue required precision, not brute force. A direct assault would likely result in Whitmore's death before they could even breach the door. Damian communicated his plan through gestures and quiet, urgent whispers that were barely audible over the water. He would create a diversion on the far side of the mill, drawing the guards away from the entrance. Delilah, leveraging the darkness and her smaller stature, was to wait for the door to be left unattended and slip inside to locate Whitmore. It was a risk that went against every instinct Damian possessed to protect her, yet there was no other option. He needed to be the threat that drew the fire. The execution began with a silence that was more terrifying than noise. Damian vanished into the brush, circling the perimeter. Moments later, the sound of splintering wood and a heavy crash echoed from the rear of the mill, followed by the distinct heavy thud of a stone striking the water wheel. The guards at the door jumped, exchanging confused shouts. Assuming the old structure was finally collapsing or that an animal had triggered a collapse, one guard ventured into the darkness to investigate, pistol drawn. The second hesitated, then followed a few steps, peering into the gloom. It was the opening Delilah needed. She moved from the wall, keeping low, her silk skirts heavy with mud, and slipped through the door, just as the guards turned the corner of the building. The interior of the mill was a cavernous space, smelling of rot, damp wood, and fear. In the center of the room, illuminated by a single lantern placed on a crate, sat James Whitmore. He was tied to a chair, his face bruised and swollen, his breathing shallow and rattling in his chest. A third man, the interrogator, was standing over him, his back to the door, frustrated by the old man's stubborn silence regarding the location of the diary. Delilah scanned the room for a weapon, her eyes landing on a rusted iron bar lying amidst the debris near the entrance. She picked it up, the cold metal biting into her palm. The interrogator, sensing a change in the air draft or perhaps hearing the rustle of fabric, began to turn. Delilah did not hesitate. Driven by a surge of protective fury, she swung the bar with all her strength, striking a stack of empty barrels next to him. The sudden thunderous crash in the enclosed space disoriented the man completely. He spun around, stumbling, just as Damian, having circled back with impossible speed, burst through the rear entrance he had forced open. The ensuing struggle was brief and violent. Damian tackled the interrogator, the momentum carrying them both into the wall. Outside, the shouts of the returning guards grew louder. There was no time for a protracted fight. Damian subdued the man with a precise, ruthless blow, leaving him unconscious on the floor. He then turned his attention to Whitmore's bonds, slicing through the ropes with a knife he produced from his boot. The old man slumped forward, barely conscious, whispering a litany of apologies that were lost in the urgency of the moment. "We have to move," Damian commanded, hauling Whitmore to his feet. The invalid groaned, his legs buckling, but Damian supported his weight, effectively carrying him. Delilah took the lead, pushing open the heavy loading doors at the side of the mill that opened directly onto the riverbank. The drop was only a few feet to the muddy shore. They tumbled out into the cold night, just as the front door burst open and the two guards rushed back in, realizing they had been duped. The chase that followed was a nightmare of stumbling through darkness. The guards, realizing their prisoner was gone and their pay forfeit, pursued with the desperation of men who knew the price of failure. A pistol shot cracked through the air, the ball whistling harmlessly into the trees above their heads, but the sound served to spur them on. They scrambled up the riverbank, slipping on wet stones, dragging the semi-conscious Whitmore through the undergrowth. The carriage was miles away. They needed a closer refuge or a way to lose their pursuers. In the dense woods, Damian veered off the main path, heading toward a dense thicket of holly and ancient oaks. He knew the landscape better than the London thugs chasing them. He led them into a narrow ravine, the sides steep and overgrown, effectively vanishing from the line of sight. They huddled in the darkness, listening to the guards crashing through the brush above them, cursing and arguing about which direction the fugitives had taken. The sounds of pursuit drifted further away, moving toward the road, assuming the escapees would head for open ground. In the relative safety of the ravine, Damian checked Whitmore's condition. The man was battered and exhausted, but his mind was lucid. He looked at Delilah, his eyes filled with shame. He confirmed that the men were indeed Pemberton's agents, sent to clean up the last loose end of the conspiracy. But then, as he caught his breath, he offered a piece of information that chilled the blood more than the night air. The diary, he rasped, was not the only leverage. There was a reason. Philip had been so easily manipulated, a reason beyond simple debt. Pemberton held something else over the Montford family, a letter written by the late Marquis himself just days before his death. Philip believed this letter had been destroyed, but Pemberton had kept it. Whitmore did not know the contents, only that the mere mention of it terrified Philip into absolute submission. It was this letter that had forced Philip's hand 8 years ago, suggesting that the initial debt was perhaps not Philip's doing, but a burden inherited and then compounded by blackmail. This revelation reshaped the entire narrative. Philip was not merely a greedy opportunist. He was a man held hostage. The conspiracy was a trap that had snapped shut on him long before he turned on Damian. The villainy of Pemberton was far more insidious than simple extortion. He had weaponized the family's honor against them, using the father's sins to enslave the son. Damian absorbed this information with a grim silence. The picture was becoming clearer, but also more dangerous. They were not just fighting to clear a name, they were fighting to break a stranglehold that had destroyed one generation and was currently consuming the next. The diary was the sword to strike at Pemberton, but the letter was the shield that protected Philip's compliance. To truly free the family and restore honor, they needed both. They waited until the forest was silent before moving again. It took hours to navigate back to the carriage, a slow, agonizing trek supporting the injured man. When they finally reached the vehicle, hidden beneath the boughs of a weeping willow, dawn was threatening to break, bleeding a pale grey light into the sky. They loaded Whitmore. Inside, wrapping him in blankets, the coachman, wide-eyed but loyal, snapped the reins without a word, and the carriage lurched forward, leaving the nightmare of Blackwood Mill behind. Inside the carriage, the atmosphere was heavy with exhaustion and unspoken fears. Delilah watched the trees blur past, her mind racing. They had the witness. They had the diary. But the enemy now knew they were active. The element of surprise was gone. Pemberton would know within hours that his men had failed, and he would realize that the Duke and Delilah were working together. The road back to London felt less like a return home and more like an approach to a battlefield, as the city's skyline began to emerge from the morning mist, grey and imposing. Damian opened the diary to the final pages. He read in silence, his expression hardening. The entries from the last few weeks detailed meetings not just with thugs, but with solicitors and bankers. Pemberton was liquidating assets, preparing to move. He knew the fragile house of cards was trembling. But the final entry, scribbled in haste, mentioned a name that made Damian close the book with a snap. It was a name from the highest echelons of the judiciary, a judge known for his severity and his connections to the old guard. Pemberton wasn't just planning to run, he was planning to use the law to crush his enemies before he left. They were driving straight into a legal trap. If they went to the authorities with the diary now, they might find the very person receiving the evidence was on Pemberton's payroll. They needed a strategy that bypassed the corrupt channels. They needed to confront Philip, not with anger, but with the terrifying truth of his own enslavement. They had to turn the brother against the blackmailer before the judge could issue a warrant for Damian's arrest, or worse, for Delilah's. The carriage rattled over the cobblestones of London, the city waking up around them, indifferent to the drama playing out within its streets. They could not go to the Montford house, it would be watched. They could not go to Damian's temporary lodgings. It would be the first place the authorities looked. They were fugitives in their own city, carrying the truth in a leather book and a dying man's memory. As they turned a corner, Delilah saw a newspaper boy shouting headlines on the corner. The words were indistinct, but the name Ashworth caught her ear. It was Beatrice's family. A realization dawned on her. The social network, the gossips, the very people she had despised for their shallowness. They were the only court Pemberton couldn't bribe, the court of public opinion. If the law was compromised, they would have to try the case in the ballrooms. But before they could formulate a plan, the carriage slowed abruptly. The road ahead was blocked, not by traffic, but by a blockade of uniformed constables. They were checking carriages entering Mayfair. Pemberton had moved faster than they anticipated. The net was closing. Damian looked at Delilah, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol he had taken from the guard at the mill. "We cannot." "Stop," he said, his voice calm but absolute. "If they take this diary, the truth disappears forever." Delilah looked at the blockade, then at the side streets that offered a labyrinthine escape. She reached out and placed her hand over Damian's, stopping him from drawing the weapon. "No guns," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "We play this differently." She leaned forward and opened the partition to the driver. "Turn," she commanded. "Take us to the one place they will never expect a duke and a lady to hide." The carriage swerved violently, mounting the curb and scattering pedestrians as it dove into the narrow, fog-choked alleyways of the East End. Behind them, whistles blew and shouts erupted, signalling the beginning of a hunt that would tear through the heart of London. They had the evidence, but they had nowhere to land, and the city that should have been their sanctuary had turned its teeth against them. The carriage careened into the labyrinthine sprawl of the East End, the wheels rattling violently against the uneven cobblestones of Whitechapel. The fog, thicker here near the river, swallowed the vehicle whole, wrapping it in a protective shroud of grey that dampened the sounds of the pursuit. Delilah's directive to the driver had been precise, leading them away from the manicured squares of the aristocracy and into the chaotic industrial heart of London's trade district. It was a world entirely alien to her upbringing, a landscape of looming warehouses, narrow alleys, and the pervasive scent of coal smoke and brine. The police blockade at the edge of Mayfair had been left behind, the constables unwilling or unable to follow a phantom carriage into the dense warren of the Docklands without specific orders. They sought refuge in a nondescript warehouse near the Thames, a structure ostensibly used for storing imported spices, but which served in reality as the clandestine headquarters for Damian's trading operations. It was a location unknown to society, unknown to Pemberton, and crucially unknown to the corrupt elements of the judiciary now. Hunting them, the space was cavernous and cold, filled with crates stamped with the marks of the East India Company. Here, amidst the scent of cardamom and damp wood, they finally stopped. The immediate priority was James Whitmore. The journey had taken a toll on the invalid, his breathing shallow and laboured. Damian and the coachman moved him to a makeshift cot in a small office partitioned off from the main floor, doing what they could to stabilise him with the limited supplies available. In the relative safety of the warehouse, the magnitude of the conspiracy began to crystallise. Damian laid the leather-bound diary onto a crate used as a table, illuminating the pages with a single lantern. The entries were a damning chronology of corruption. They detailed not only the payments made to Whitmore, but also a series of subsequent transactions linking Lord Pemberton to Sir Arthur Calloway, a High Court judge known for his ruthless sentencing and unassailable reputation. The connection was clear. Pemberton had not merely framed a duke. He had purchased the law itself to ensure the frame held. But the most chilling realization came from the dates. The payments to the judge had escalated in the last week. Pemberton was not just defending his past crimes, he was preparing for a new legal offensive. Whitmore, lucid in spurts between bouts of coughing, provided the final missing piece of the puzzle regarding Philip. He spoke of the blackmail letter, the document that had turned the Marquis of Ashford into a pawn. It was not a simple matter of gambling debts. The late Marquis, Philip and Delilah's father, had been involved in a scheme to defraud the Crown during the war years, supplying substandard timber for naval ships. The discovery of such a crime would mean not just financial ruin, but a charge of treason, the stripping of the title, and the complete annihilation of the Montford lineage. Pemberton possessed the proofs of this treason. Philip had been protecting not just his own reputation, but the very existence of his family name, and by extension, Delilah's future. He had destroyed Damian to prevent the execution of his father's legacy. Delilah absorbed this revelation with a numbness that slowly hardened into resolve. Her brother was not the architect of the villainy, but its jailer, trapped in a cell built by their father's sins. However, the diary revealed a new, immediate threat. An entry from 2 days prior noted a plan to liquidate the Ashford asset. Pemberton, sensing the walls closing in with Damian's return and investigation, intended to cut his losses. The narrative he was constructing was simple and deadly. Philip would be framed for the murder of the missing James Whitmore, the police blockade, the hunt for the carriage. It was all part of a script where Philip would be arrested, tried by the corrupt Judge Calloway, and likely hanged or transported, leaving Pemberton free to seize the remaining Montford assets and bury the truth forever. They were not just fugitives. They were the only thing standing between Philip and the gallows. The realization shifted. Their strategy. Hiding in the East End would save them for a night, but it would doom Philip by morning. If the police reached Montford House before they did, the trap would spring. They had to return to the lion's den. They had to break into their own home, confront Philip with the reality of his expendability, and secure his testimony before the authorities arrived. The return to Mayfair was a tactical operation executed under the cover of the deepening night. They abandoned the carriage, which was too conspicuous, and travelled by river, a small skiff taking them upstream to a quiet landing near Westminster. From there, they moved on foot, sticking to the shadows, avoiding the gaslit main thoroughfares. Delilah led the way now, her knowledge of the city's geography proving as vital as Damian's strength. They approached Grosvenor Square from the service lanes, navigating the narrow mews that ran behind the great houses. Montford House was dark, save for a single light burning in the library window on the ground floor. The silence of the house was ominous. There were no servants visible, no carriages waiting. It had the air of a mausoleum. Delilah knew the servants' entrance would be bolted, but she also knew of a loose grate in the coal cellar, a defect she had discovered as a child and never reported. It was a tight squeeze, undignified for a duke and a lady, but they slipped through into the subterranean darkness of the house, emerging into the kitchens covered in coal dust but undetected. They moved through the silent hallways, the familiar portraits of ancestors watching them from the walls, ancestors whose honor was now revealed to be a fragile facade. When they reached the library doors, Delilah hesitated for only a fraction of a second before pushing them open. Philip was inside. He was sitting at his desk, but he was not working. A pair of dueling pistols lay before him on the polished mahogany surface. He looked up as they entered, his face gaunt, his eyes hollowed out by days of sleepless terror. He did not seem surprised to see them. He looked like a man who had passed beyond surprise into a state of fatalistic acceptance. He reached for a pistol, not with aggression, but with a weary defensive instinct. Damian stepped forward into the light, his hands raised to show he was unarmed, though the diary was clutched in his grip like a weapon. He did not attack. He simply placed the book on the desk, directly over the pistols. He spoke with a calm authority, dismantling the narrative Philip had been living. He laid out the betrayal, not the one Philip had committed, but the one being committed against him. He explained that Pemberton had no intention of letting Philip survive the scandal. The protection Philip believed he was buying was a myth. To Pemberton, Philip was merely a loose end, a liability that knew too much. Philip listened, his hand hovering over the gun. He tried to argue, to fall back on the tired justifications of duty and family honor, but Delilah cut him off. She spoke of the treason, of the father's crime. She stripped away the illusion that Philip was protecting the family. By continuing to serve Pemberton, he was ensuring the family's ultimate destruction. She told him of the judge, of the plan to frame him for Whitmore's murder. She revealed that the police were not hunting Damian to return him to prison. They were hunting him to prevent him from saving Philip. The breaking point came when Damian revealed the final piece of evidence from the diary, a note regarding the sanitization of Montford House. Pemberton had arranged for a search of the property to be conducted at dawn, a search guaranteed to find evidence of Whitmore's demise planted by Pemberton's agents. Philip was not the partner in this conspiracy. He was the scapegoat. The color drained from Philip's face entirely. The realization that his sacrifice, his compromise of ethics, and his betrayal of his sister had all been for nothing shattered him. He slumped back in his chair, the pistol forgotten. The silence in the room was heavy, the shifting of a world view that had held him captive for 8 years. He looked from the diary to his sister, seeing not judgment, but a terrified plea for survival. He made his choice. With a trembling hand, he pushed the pistols away and pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him. He began to write, his pen scratching furiously against the silence. It was not a confession of the card game alone. It was a full accounting of the treason, the blackmail, and the conspiracy with Pemberton. He was effectively signing his own social death warrant to save his life and honor. But the moment of resolution was shattered by a sound that echoed through the entire house, a heavy, thunderous pounding on the front door. It was not the polite knock of a visitor. It was the demand of authority. Voices shouted from the street, muffled by the heavy oak, but unmistakable in their intent. "Open in the name of the king, by order of the High Court." Delilah rushed to the window, peeling back the heavy velvet curtain just an inch. Outside, the street was filled with uniformed officers and men in plain clothes holding lanterns. And, standing at the forefront, bathed in the flickering light, was Lord Pemberton, accompanied by a man in judicial robes. They had arrived hours early. The dawn raid had been moved up. The trap had sprung while they were still inside the cage. Philip looked at the door, then at Damian. Panic flared in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a steely resolve. He stood up, clutching the paper he had just written. He handed the document to Delilah, his hands steady for the first time in years. He told them to run, to use the cellar exit. He would hold the door. He would buy them the time to get the diary and his confession to a magistrate who wasn't in Pemberton's pocket. Damian refused. He barred the library door with a heavy chair, locking it from the inside. They were not leaving Philip to be silenced. They had the truth, they had the witnesses, and they had the confession. But they were trapped in a single room, with the entire force of the corrupt law hammering at the gates. The wood of the front door splintered under the force of a battering ram. The invaders were inside the house. Footsteps thundered in the hallway, approaching the library. The sanctuary had become a fortress, and the siege had begun. The only way out was not escape, but a confrontation that would either clear the Veilbrook name or see them all hanged before sunrise. The barricade was a temporary measure. Against an inevitability, the heavy oak door of the library, reinforced by centuries of craftsmanship, groaned under the assault of the battering ram. Dust motes danced in the tremors of the impact, settling on the shoulders of the three figures trapped inside. The air in the room was thick with the scent of old paper and the sharp metallic tang of adrenaline. Philip stood by the desk, his knuckles white as he gripped the confession he had just penned, a document that effectively dismantled his life to save his soul. Delilah stood beside Damian, her hand brushing against his, a silent communication of unity in the face of destruction. Damian, however, was not looking at the door. He was looking at the clock on the mantelpiece, calculating the seconds with the cold precision of a man who had already placed his pieces on the board and was merely waiting for the opponent to realize the trap. With a final, deafening crack, the wood around the lock splintered. The door swung open, crashing against the interior wall. The hallway beyond was flooded with the harsh, artificial light of lanterns held by uniformed constables. Striding into the room, flanked by the corrupt Judge Calloway and a cadre of private guards disguised as deputies, was Lord Pemberton. His expression was one of triumphant malice. He did not see a family making a last stand. He saw a loose end ready to be severed. He immediately commanded the officers to arrest the Marquis of Ashford for the murder of James Whitmore and the Duke of Veilbrook as an accomplice to the crime, citing evidence that had supposedly been found in the scullery, evidence that Pemberton's men had planted mere minutes before. The constables moved forward, hesitation visible in their eyes, but driven by the authority of the High Court judge standing behind them. It was a tableau of absolute power, crushing helpless resistance. But the arrest was halted not by force, but by a sound. It was the sound of a heavy, leather-bound book slamming onto the desk. Damian stepped into the light, placing his hand atop the diary they had retrieved from the mill. He did not speak to Pemberton or the judge. He addressed the senior constable directly, invoking his right as a peer of the realm to be heard before being detained. He stated calmly that James Whitmore was not dead. The declaration hung in the air, freezing the room. Pemberton's sneer faltered. Damian revealed the maneuver. He had executed during the chaotic hours in the East End. While Delilah had planned the return to Montford House, Damian had dispatched his most trusted coachman to deliver the injured Whitmore not to a hospital, but to the private residence of the Home Secretary, a man whose rivalry with Judge Calloway was an open secret in Westminster. The fugitive run to the warehouse had been a diversion to draw Pemberton's resources away, while the real witness was secured by the highest authority in the land. Pemberton's face drained of colour as the implications struck home. If Whitmore was alive and in the custody of the Home Office, the murder charge was a fabrication, and if the murder charge was false, the basis for the raid evaporated. Judge Calloway, realizing the perilous shift in the wind, attempted to interject, claiming the Duke was lying to obstruct justice. But Philip stepped forward then. He did not cower or plead. He held up the confession he had written, the ink barely dry. He declared to the room at large that he was surrendering himself not for murder, but for conspiracy, fraud, and the concealment of treason. He admitted loud and clear to the framing of the Duke of Veilbrook 8 years prior, implicating Pemberton as the architect and Calloway as the beneficiary of the bribes detailed in the diary on the desk. The dynamic of the room inverted instantly. The constables, realizing they had been used as pawns in a criminal enterprise involving a High Court judge, lowered their weapons. The senior officer, a veteran of the force who knew the smell of corruption, turned his gaze from the Duke to the judge. The diary was opened. Damian pointed to the specific entries, dates, amounts, and locations, corresponding to Calloway's own schedule. The evidence was circumstantial on its own, but combined with Philip's confession and the existence of a living witness, it was a death knell for the conspirators. Pemberton, stripped of his legal shield, attempted to flee. He lunged for the open door, knocking aside a stunned deputy, but he did not make it. To the hallway, Damian moved with the explosive speed that had kept him alive in the colonies, intercepting the Lord and pinning him against the doorframe. There was no brawl, only the decisive application of superior force. Pemberton was restrained, his protests devolving into incoherent threats about the Montford treason letter, the blackmail. Material he believed was his final ace. Delilah watched as the constables took custody of Pemberton and the trembling judge. As the handcuffs clicked shut, Pemberton screamed that the Montford name would burn with him, that he would release the proof of the late Marquis's crimes against the crown. Philip met the threat with a silence that spoke volumes. He had already accepted the fire. By confessing to the concealment, he had neutralized the blackmail. The secret was out. It could no longer be used to control him. He had chosen to burn down his own house to ensure Pemberton perished in the flames. The dawn that broke over Grosvenor Square brought a different kind of storm. The removal of a High Court judge and a prominent lord in irons was a spectacle that drew the eyes of the entire city. Philip was led away separately, his head held high, acknowledging Delilah with a faint, sad smile, before disappearing into the police carriage. He was a prisoner, yes, but for the first time in 8 years, he looked like a free man. The aftermath was a long, painful exorcism of the past. The scandal of the trial dominated the newspapers for months. The testimony of James Whitmore, given from his sickbed, combined with the diary and Philip's confession, resulted in lengthy sentences for Pemberton and Calloway. Philip was stripped of much of his remaining fortune to pay fines and restitution, and while he avoided the gallows due to his cooperation and the exposure of the greater corruption, he was sentenced to a period of exile and stripped of his seat in the Lords. The Montford name was tarnished, the treason of the father finally revealed, but the truth, ugly and raw, had cauterized the wound. For Damian, the vindication was absolute. His title was restored in full standing, his honor polished clean by the public record. Yet the victory was not found in the restoration of his rank, but in the quiet moments that followed. He and Delilah retreated to Veilbrook, the country estate that had sat empty for so long. There, far from the whispers of London, they began the work of rebuilding. Not just the estate, but a life defined by their own choices rather than the sins of their fathers. The seasons turned. The harsh winter gave way to a tentative spring. Philip wrote from his exile in the Americas, letters that spoke of hard work and a strange, newfound peace in a land where his title meant nothing and his character meant everything. He was building a business, slowly, honestly. The reconciliation was distant, but the bridge had been built. A year after the storm that had brought Damian back to London, the nursery at Veilbrook was bathed in the warm, golden light of late afternoon. Delilah sat by the window, rocking a cradle, the infant inside, a son, named Thomas, after the late Duke, whose memory had finally been laid to rest, slept soundly. Damian stood in the doorway, watching them. The ghosts that had haunted him, the anger, the need for vengeance, the bitter cold of injustice, had faded, replaced by the warmth of the scene before him. He crossed the room and knelt beside his wife and son. They had walked through the fire of scandal and the wreckage of betrayal to find this peace. The past was a scar they would always carry, a reminder of the cost of lies, but it was no longer a wound that bled. As Damian reached out to touch the hand of his sleeping son, he realized that the true victory was not in destroying his enemies, but in refusing to let them destroy his capacity to love. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that was not empty, but full of promise. Yet, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the estate, a rider appeared on the distant ridge, silhouette dark against the dying light, watching the house for a moment before turning and galloping away into the encroaching night. A reminder that in a world built on power and secrets, peace is a garden that must be constantly guarded.